slicked sidewalk of Beacon Hill, staring at the locked door of the brownstone she had called home for 37 years. The brass knocker gleamed under the street lamp, mocking her. Inside those walls, her husband Thomas had died just 6 weeks ago, his heart giving out in the study, where he'd spent countless evenings reviewing documents she never questioned. Inside those walls, her daughter Cassandra had grown from a bright-eyed girl into something Eleanor no longer recognized. And inside those walls, a betrayal so profound had unfolded that Eleanor could barely breathe when she thought about it. How did I not see it coming? She wondered, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked window. How did I raise a monster? This is a story about the invisible wounds families inflict on each other, about greed that wears the mask of love, and about a woman who discovered that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from what we build, but from what we're willing to burn down. By the end, you'll understand how a forged signature can steal more than money. It can steal identity itself. You'll see how justice, when it finally arrives, tastes both sweet and bitter. And you'll witness the moment a broken woman realizes that forgiveness is not always the path to healing. What Eleanor Ashford lost in those weeks after Thomas's death would have destroyed most people. What she gained would transform her into something far more dangerous than her daughter ever anticipated. The numbers themselves were staggering. $33 million, accumulated through 3 generations of careful investment, real estate holdings across Massachusetts, and Thomas's pharmaceutical consulting work. But this story isn't really about money, though money set everything in motion. It's about the moment a daughter looked at her grieving mother and saw not a parent, but an obstacle. It's about the cold calculation behind a loving smile, the planning that happened while Eleanor served tea and spoke about funeral arrangements. Cassandra had waited, patient as a spider, for her father's last breath. And when it came, she moved with surgical precision. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from family betrayal. It's not the sharp stab of a stranger's knife, but the slow poisoning of everything you believed about your life. Eleanor had thought herself blessed. A devoted husband, a beautiful daughter, a home filled with history and warmth. She had played her role perfectly. The supportive wife, the loving mother, the gracious hostess at charity galas where Boston's elite sipped champagne and pretended their money made them better people. She had asked for so little, expecting that love and loyalty were simply the natural order of things. I was such a fool, she would think later. I mistook silence for peace and obedience for love. The night Cassandra changed the locks, Eleanor stood in that same spot on the sidewalk, a single suitcase at her feet containing the few items she'd been allowed to retrieve. Her daughter had hired movers, lawyers, and security, all within 48 hours of Thomas's funeral. The efficiency was breathtaking. The cruelty was absolute. Cassandra's husband, Derek, had stood in the doorway with arms crossed, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his expression blank as a wall. "The will is clear," he'd said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "The property belongs to Cassandra now. You'll need to make other arrangements." Other arrangements, as if 37 years could be packed away like summer clothes, stored and forgotten. But here's what Cassandra didn't know, what Derek in all his arrogance couldn't imagine. Eleanor Ashford had not spent nearly 4 decades married to Thomas without learning something about patience, about observation, about the small details that reveal larger truths. She had watched her husband work late into countless nights, had noticed the way he carefully filed certain documents in a specific drawer, had remembered the name of the lawyer he trusted above all others, James Chen, a quiet man who had attended Thomas's funeral and pressed a business card into Eleanor's hand with a meaningful look. "If you need anything," James had whispered. "Anything at all, please call me." She had tucked that card into her coat pocket, not understanding its significance then. She understood now, and that understanding would change everything. The Residence Inn in Cambridge smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and other people's disappointments. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the generic watercolor print on the wall. A lighthouse, beacon of hope, painfully on the nose. Around her, the detritus of a life condensed. One suitcase, her purse, a cardboard box containing photo albums Cassandra had graciously allowed her to take. The television murmured in the corner, some morning show host laughing about something trivial. Eleanor couldn't make herself turn it off. The silence underneath was too vast, too full of questions she couldn't yet answer. Is this what I deserve? She wondered. Did I fail somehow as a mother, create this coldness without knowing? The first week passed in a fog of disbelief. She would wake at dawn, momentarily forgetting where she was, reaching automatically for Thomas's warmth beside her before reality crashed back. Gone. He was gone, and so was everything else. She ate little, slept less, and found herself replaying every interaction with Cassandra over the past year, searching for clues she'd missed. There had been subtle changes, a new hardness around her daughter's eyes, impatience that flashed when Eleanor spoke too long about ordinary things, the way Cassandra had started bringing Derek to every family dinner. The two of them exchanging glances Eleanor couldn't decode. Thomas had noticed too. Something's different with Cass, he'd said once, about 4 months before his death. She asks a lot of questions about the estate planning. Eleanor had dismissed it. Of course their daughter would be curious about their affairs. It was responsible, even admirable. She'd been so wrong. James Chen's business card lived on the nightstand, a small rectangle of heavy cream paper with embossed lettering. Chen and Associates, Estate Law. Eleanor picked it up and set it down a dozen times a day, her courage faltering each time she considered making the call. What could he do? Cassandra had the will. She'd shown it to Eleanor that terrible afternoon, her voice syrupy with false concern. I know this seems sudden, Mother, but Dad was very clear. He left the estate to me to manage. He thought you might not be capable of handling such complex finances on your own. He wanted to protect you. The words had been carefully chosen, each one a small blade designed to cut Eleanor's confidence. She'd felt herself shrinking under her daughter's gaze, felt the years of deference and peacekeeping rising up to swallow her protests. But something else had risen too, a small, hot spark of anger. On the 8th day, Eleanor made the call. Her hands shook as she dialed, and when James's receptionist answered, her voice came out thin and uncertain. But within an hour, she sat in a leather chair in a mahogany-paneled office in downtown Boston, and James Chen sat across from her with an expression that mixed concern and something else, something that looked like relief. Mrs. Ashford, he said gently, I'm so glad you contacted me. I've been hoping you would. He opened a file folder, and Eleanor glimpsed Thomas's handwriting on several documents inside. Your husband came to see me 3 months before his death. He wanted to update his will, make absolutely certain everything was in order. He was very specific about his wishes. The room seemed to tilt slightly as James continued. Mrs. Ashford, the will your daughter presented to you, I've heard about it through mutual connections in the legal community, and I need you to understand something crucial. I drafted Thomas's actual last will and testament, witnessed and properly executed. In it, you are the primary beneficiary of the entire estate, with the exception of a $2 million trust for Cassandra that would vest when she turned 40, provided certain conditions were met. Thomas was concerned about some of your daughter's recent decisions. He never intended for you to be left with nothing. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication, of fury held too long in check. Then what Cassandra showed me is a forgery, James said quietly. And that, Mrs. Ashford, is a serious crime. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. James explained the legal remedies available, the process of challenging the fraudulent will, the possibility of criminal charges. He was methodical and thorough, but Eleanor heard the anger beneath his professional calm. Thomas had been his friend as well as his client. This wasn't just business to James, it was personal. As Eleanor left his office that afternoon, the autumn sun breaking through the clouds over Boston Common, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Purpose. Cassandra had made a critical error. She'd underestimated her mother, dismissed her as a relic from another era, too weak or too foolish to fight back. That miscalculation would cost her everything. You wanted to know what I'm capable of, darling? Eleanor thought, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she smiled. Let me show you. But could a mother really destroy her own daughter, even if that daughter had struck first? Or would love, in the end, prove stronger than justice? The fraud investigation moved with surprising speed once James filed the necessary paperwork with the probate court. Within days, a forensic document examiner was analyzing the will Cassandra had submitted, comparing signatures, studying paper composition, and ink dating. Eleanor met with detectives from the Massachusetts State Police, their questions pointed but not unkind. They'd seen cases like this before, they told her. Family members forging wills, exploiting the chaos and grief that followed a death. Elder financial abuse is more common than people realize, Detective Maria Torres explained, her dark eyes sharp with professional focus. And it's often perpetrated by the people closest to the victim. The word victim landed hard. Eleanor had never thought of herself that way. But sitting in that sterile interview room, recounting how her daughter had locked her out of her own home, she realized it was accurate. The evidence mounted quickly. The signature on the fraudulent will didn't match Thomas's hand, not even close, according to the examiner's report. The document had been created on Cassandra's home printer, traceable through microscopic variations in the toner. Most damning of all, Thomas's actual will, properly filed and witnessed, existed in James Chen's secure files, with a paper trail a mile long. Cassandra had been sloppy in her greed, assuming no one would question her, or that her mother would simply accept defeat. It was the kind of arrogance that came from a lifetime of getting away with smaller deceptions, each one building confidence for the next. Eleanor thought back to Cassandra's teenage years, the lies about where she was going, who she was with, small thefts of cash from Eleanor's purse that were never quite provable. She'd wanted to believe her daughter would outgrow it. Instead, Cassandra had simply grown bolder. James arranged for Eleanor to stay in a small apartment in Back Bay, one of Thomas's properties that had been held in a separate trust and thus beyond Cassandra's reach. It was modest compared to the Beacon Hill brownstone, just 2 bedrooms, a galley kitchen, tall windows overlooking Commonwealth Avenue. But to Eleanor, it felt like a fortress. She was no longer homeless, no longer helpless. She began to reclaim small pieces of her dignity, buying fresh flowers for the table, cooking proper meals, sleeping through the night without jolting awake in panic. But beneath the surface routines, something harder was crystallizing. She wasn't the same woman who'd stood on that rainy sidewalk 8 weeks ago. That woman had been broken by betrayal. This woman was being forged by it. The plan James laid out was straightforward, but would require courage. They would expose the forgery, file criminal charges, and seek to have Eleanor installed as the executor of Thomas's true estate. It meant going to war with her own daughter, a battle that would be public and ugly. Boston's social circles were small and vicious. Eleanor knew the story would spread like wildfire through the country clubs and charity boards where she'd once felt welcome. She would be pitied, gossiped about, analyzed. Cassandra would paint herself as the victim of a vindictive, mentally unstable mother. Derek would hire expensive lawyers, spin narratives, drag everything through the mud. "Are you prepared for that?" James asked, and Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. "I'm prepared for the truth," she said, "whatever comes with it." But there was another element to the strategy that James mentioned almost casually, and it caught Eleanor completely off guard. "We should also look into Derek's business dealings," he said, pulling out another file. "Your husband mentioned some concerns before he died. Thought Derek might be involved in some questionable financial arrangements. If there's anything there, it could strengthen your case, show a pattern of fraudulent behavior in the family." Eleanor's pulse quickened. Thomas had never discussed his suspicions with her directly, but she remembered tensions at family dinners, the way Thomas's jaw would tighten when Derek talked about his investment firm. Could there be more to this story than just a forged will? The possibility opened up like a chasm, dark and full of unknowns. Whatever lay at the bottom might change everything. How deep does this corruption go? Eleanor wondered, and part of her feared the answer even as she needed to know. Would exposing her daughter's greed reveal something even darker about the family she thought she knew? The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning, when Cassandra was having coffee with friends at a cafe on Newbury Street. Eleanor wasn't there to see it. James thought it best she maintain distance from the confrontation, but she heard about it within hours. Detective Torres herself made the call. "Mrs. Ashford, I wanted you to know that Cassandra Brennan and Derek Brennan were taken into custody this morning on charges of forgery, fraud, and elder abuse. They're being processed now." Eleanor's hand trembled so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Some part of her hadn't truly believed it would come to this. Hadn't wanted to believe her daughter would actually be arrested, handcuffed, led away like a common criminal. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger these past weeks, felt a cold satisfaction. This is what justice looks like, she thought. This is the price of betrayal. The media coverage was immediate and merciless. Beacon Hill heiress arrested in will forgery scheme. The headlines screamed. Local news stations ran footage of Cassandra and Derek being led from their Brookline home, their faces hard and furious. The comment sections online filled with speculation and judgment, some people defending Cassandra, claiming Eleanor must be a terrible mother to drive her daughter to such lengths. Others condemning the greed that would make a child steal from a grieving parent. Eleanor forced herself to read some of it, to see how her life looked from the outside. It was surreal and painful, but also clarifying. She'd spent so much of her life caring what people thought, maintaining appearances, being gracious and accommodating. Now her family's dysfunction was public entertainment. And somehow she found she didn't care as much as she'd expected. The truth mattered more than her reputation. The criminal proceedings moved forward with bureaucratic efficiency. Cassandra and Derek were released on bail, their lawyers immediately filing motions to dismiss and attacking the validity of the supposed real will. They claimed Eleanor had manipulated Thomas in his final months, that he'd been suffering from cognitive decline, that the will James held was the forgery, not Cassandra's version. It was a bold strategy, built on lies piled on lies, and it required them to destroy Eleanor's credibility completely. The depositions were brutal. Cassandra's attorney, a silver-haired shark named Richard Morrison, treated Eleanor like a hostile witness from the start. "Mrs. Ashford, isn't it true that you suffered from depression after your husband's death? That you were briefly hospitalized?" The question was designed to make her seem unstable, unreliable. Eleanor took a breath and answered calmly, "I had a panic attack the day my daughter locked me out of my home and left me homeless. I went to an emergency room as a precaution. I was released the same day with no diagnosis of mental illness. But the real earthquake came during the investigation into Derek's business practices. James's instinct had been correct. There was something rotten there, and it went far deeper than anyone had anticipated. Derek ran a boutique investment firm that catered to wealthy Boston families, promising above-market returns through sophisticated international strategies. What he'd actually been doing, according to the forensic accountants brought in by the district attorney's office, was running a modified Ponzi scheme, using new investors' money to pay returns to existing clients while skimming enormous amounts for his own lifestyle. And there was more. Several of the overseas accounts Derek used had raised red flags with federal regulators. Money was moving through shell companies in ways that suggested something worse than simple fraud. The FBI got involved, and suddenly the case wasn't just about a forged will anymore. Here's where the story took a turn no one saw coming, least of all Eleanor. As federal agents dug deeper into Derek's financial network, they discovered something that made them contact Eleanor directly. Thomas had known about Derek's schemes. Not only known, he'd been helping federal investigators build a case against him for the last year of his life. Thomas had been an FBI informant, secretly recording conversations, documenting transactions, pretending to be interested in investing more family money while actually gathering evidence. The agent who explained this to Eleanor, a quiet man named Robert Keene, watched her face carefully as he spoke. "Your husband was very brave, Mrs. Ashford. He knew this might damage his relationship with his daughter, but he believed it was the right thing to do. He was protecting you, protecting other potential victims." Eleanor sat in stunned silence, processing this revelation. Thomas had been living a double life, carrying this enormous secret while his heart literally gave out from the stress. He'd known Cassandra was complicit in Derek's crimes, had evidence of it, and he'd been trying to shield Eleanor from the truth for as long as he could. "Why didn't you tell me?" she thought, grief washing over her anew. "Did you think I was too fragile to bear it?" But perhaps he'd been right. Perhaps if she'd known while he was alive, it would have destroyed her. Now, tempered by loss, she was strong enough to face it and to finish what Thomas started. When Agent Keene asked if she'd be willing to testify about what she knew, Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Tell me what you need," she said, and felt Thomas's presence like a hand on her shoulder. Would helping expose her daughter's crimes honor her husband's memory, or would it make her complicit in destroying what was left of her family? The courtroom in the John Joseph Moakley United States Courthouse was cold and austere, all pale wood and sharp angles designed to intimidate. Eleanor sat in the gallery during Cassandra and Derek's arraignment on federal charges: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. Her daughter wouldn't look at her. Cassandra stood beside her lawyer in a conservative navy suit, her blonde hair pulled back severely, her face a mask of wounded dignity. She was playing a role, Eleanor realized, performing innocence for the judge and the cameras. It was a skill Cassandra had honed since childhood, the ability to reshape reality through sheer force of will, to make people believe her version of events even when the evidence said otherwise. But this time the evidence was overwhelming. This time, her performance wouldn't be enough. The case against Derek was airtight. The FBI had recordings, documents, testimony from other investors he'd defrauded. The money trail showed that at least $7 million had been siphoned through accounts he controlled, money that had disappeared into luxury purchases and offshore havens. Cassandra's involvement was more complicated to prove, but prosecutors had emails showing she knew about the schemes and had actively helped conceal them. She'd created fake documents, lied to clients who asked questions, and used her family's reputation to lure new investors into Derek's trap. The woman Eleanor had raised, the girl who'd once made Mother's Day cards decorated with careful crayon hearts, had become a sophisticated criminal. How did it happen? When did calculation replace conscience? The trial lasted 3 weeks, a parade of witnesses and experts and victims. Eleanor attended every day, sitting in the same seat, her face composed even when the testimony cut deep. Other families told stories of losing retirement savings, college funds, money set aside for medical care. Derek had taken it all with a smile and a handshake, assuring them their investments were safe while he bought vacation homes and luxury cars. Cassandra had been right there beside him, playing the dutiful wife, the respectable Boston socialite, all while helping to rob people blind. The prosecutors painted a picture of a couple intoxicated by greed, willing to betray anyone, including Cassandra's own parents, to maintain their lavish lifestyle. And when Thomas had threatened to expose them by refusing to invest more family money, they'd accelerated their timeline, knowing his death would give them access to the estate they desperately needed to cover their losses. But the most devastating testimony came from James Chen, who described the changes he'd witnessed in Thomas during those final months. He was under enormous stress, James told the jury, his voice heavy with sadness. He loved his daughter, but he'd realized she was beyond his help. He was terrified of what would happen to his wife after he was gone, terrified that Cassandra would manipulate or harm her. That's why he came to me to update the will, to make absolutely certain Eleanor would be protected. He told me. James paused, glancing at Eleanor. He told me that Cassandra had become a stranger to him, that he didn't recognize his own child anymore. It broke his heart. Eleanor felt tears sliding down her face, not bothering to wipe them away. Thomas had known. He'd seen what she'd been too blind to see, and it had killed him as surely as the heart attack. The verdict, when it came, was swift. Guilty on all counts. Derek's face went gray as the foreman read it out. But Cassandra remained eerily composed, as if she'd already detached from reality and retreated into some private world where she was still innocent, still wronged. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, and as the courtroom emptied, Eleanor found herself face to face with her daughter for the first time since the arrest. Cassandra's lawyer had stepped away to make a phone call, leaving them alone in the corridor. "Mother," Cassandra said, and her voice was different now, smaller, younger, uncertain. "Mother, please. I made mistakes, but I'm still your daughter. Don't let them send me to prison. You can fix this. Tell them I was confused, that Derek manipulated me, please." For just a moment, Eleanor felt the old pull, the maternal instinct to protect and forgive. "She's my baby," some ancient part of her whispered. "She needs me." But then she remembered standing on that rainy sidewalk with a single suitcase, remembered the cold calculation in Cassandra's eyes as she'd changed the locks, remembered the families whose lives her daughter had helped destroy. "No," Eleanor said quietly. "I can't fix this, Cassandra, and I won't try." And she walked away, leaving her daughter standing there, and with each step felt lighter, freer, as if she'd been carrying Cassandra's weight for 35 years and had finally set it down. Would this moment of refusal haunt her later, or was it the truest act of love, teaching her daughter that actions have consequences she can't escape? Sentencing day arrived in January, 6 months after Thomas's death. Eleanor wore a gray wool suit. Thomas had always liked her in gray and carried herself with quiet dignity as she took her seat. The courtroom was packed with victims and their families, reporters, and the merely curious who'd followed the scandal from the beginning. Cassandra and Derek sat separately now, their marriage another casualty of the case. Derek's lawyer had tried to negotiate a plea deal, throwing Cassandra under the bus in an attempt to reduce his client's sentence. It hadn't worked. Both faced significant prison time. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Holbrook, had a reputation for tough sentences in fraud cases. She didn't disappoint. Derek went first. Judge Holbrook reviewed the evidence methodically, noting the sophisticated nature of the fraud, the number of victims, the betrayal of trust. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice cutting through the hushed courtroom, "you used your education, your connections, and your wife's family name to prey on people who trusted you. You showed no remorse, no conscience, no concern for the devastation you caused. The court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. You will also pay restitution in the full amount of damages, though we all know that's unlikely to be satisfied." Derek's shoulders slumped. 15 years. He'd be nearly 60 when he got out, his career destroyed, his reputation in ruins. It was a kind of death, Eleanor thought, watching him. A death of the life he'd built on lies. Then it was Cassandra's turn. Eleanor forced herself to watch as her daughter stood before the judge, her lawyer beside her making a final plea for leniency. "Your Honor, Ms. Brennan was under her husband's influence, manipulated by his schemes. She's a first-time offender who made terrible mistakes but deserves a chance at rehabilitation." Judge Holbrook cut him off with a raised hand. "Counselor, I've read the evidence. Ms. Brennan was not a passive participant. She actively engaged in fraud, both against her husband's victims and against her own mother. The forged will, the elder abuse, these were her initiatives, not her husband's. She looked at her recently widowed mother and saw not a parent to comfort, but an obstacle to eliminate. That level of callousness disturbs me deeply." The judge turned her attention to Cassandra. "Ms. Brennan, you had every advantage. Education, opportunity, a loving family. You chose to betray all of it. You forged your father's will, stole your mother's inheritance, and left her homeless while you enjoyed the fruits of your crimes. You showed no mercy, no hesitation, no second thoughts. The court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. You will pay restitution to your mother for the estate value and additional penalties for your role in the investment fraud. 12 years. Eleanor felt the number settle into her chest, heavy and final. Her daughter would be 50 when she was released. Middle-aged, marked forever by her choices. There would be no redemption story, no easy forgiveness, no fairy tale reconciliation. After the sentencing, victims and their families approached Eleanor in the courthouse lobby. Some thanked her for her testimony, for her courage in pursuing justice even against her own child. Others shared stories of their own family betrayals, finding solidarity in shared pain. Eleanor listened to each one, understanding now that she was part of a larger pattern, a phenomenon as old as greed itself. But she also understood something else. She'd been given a chance that many of these people hadn't. Thomas's real will had been found. The estate would be restored to her. She had resources, education, connections, the tools to rebuild, to create something meaningful from the wreckage. "What will you do with this second chance?" she asked herself, standing in the cold January sunlight outside the courthouse. "How will you transform this pain into purpose?" The question felt urgent, necessary, like a promise she owed to Thomas and to herself. But first, there was one more confrontation waiting, one she both dreaded and needed, with the daughter she'd just helped send to prison. Could any words at this moment heal what was broken, or were some fractures meant to stay shattered? If you're enjoying this story so far, Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you won't miss the next one. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can even buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. Every little bit helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's get back to it. The Federal Correctional Facility in Danbury, Connecticut was a 3-hour drive from Boston. Eleanor made the trip on a gray February afternoon, the landscape outside her car window bleak and colorless. She'd debated this visit for weeks, unsure what she hoped to accomplish or whether seeing Cassandra again would do more harm than good. But something in her needed closure, needed to look her daughter in the eye one last time and say what had been left unsaid. James had advised against it. She'll try to manipulate you, he'd warned. She'll say whatever she thinks will work. Guilt, shame, promises. Don't expect genuine remorse. Eleanor knew he was right, but she went anyway. Some things couldn't be done by proxy. The visiting room was institutional and depressing. Plastic chairs, vending machines, guards watching with bored attention. Cassandra appeared after a 10-minute wait, wearing prison-issued khaki, her hair shorter than Eleanor had ever seen it, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. She looked younger somehow, vulnerable in a way that made Eleanor's heart contract painfully. For a moment, she was 8 years old again, coming home with scraped knees, seeking comfort, but that little girl was long gone, if she'd ever really existed. Cassandra sat down across from Eleanor, her expression carefully blank. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted. "But here we are." The conversation that followed was strange and stilted, full of long silences and half-finished sentences. Cassandra talked about prison life, the routine, the other inmates, the mind-numbing boredom. She asked about the brownstone, about Eleanor's health, about people they'd both known, as if they were having tea at a country club instead of sitting in a federal prison. It was surreal, this performance of normalcy when everything was broken beyond repair. Eleanor answered briefly, giving nothing of substance, waiting for Cassandra to get to the real reason she'd agreed to this visit. Finally, about 20 minutes in, it came. "Mother, I need you to understand. I was desperate. Derek had gotten us into terrible debt with his schemes, and I panicked. I thought if I could just access the estate, I could fix everything, pay people back, make it right. I never meant for it to go so far." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that Eleanor almost believed it for a split second. But then she saw the calculation behind Cassandra's eyes, the way her daughter was watching for any sign of weakness, any crack in Eleanor's resolve that could be exploited. This wasn't remorse. This was strategy. Cassandra was laying groundwork for future appeals, building a narrative of victimhood she could use to reduce her sentence. She didn't want her mother's forgiveness. She wanted her cooperation. The realization should have made Eleanor angry, but instead, she felt only a profound sadness. Her daughter was still fighting, still scheming, still unable to accept responsibility for the damage she'd caused. Prison hadn't changed her. Maybe nothing would. "You're lying," Eleanor said quietly, and watched Cassandra's expression shift. Surprise, then anger, then a mask of hurt feelings. "How can you say that? I'm your daughter. I made mistakes, yes, but I deserve some compassion." You deserve exactly what you got," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady and clear. "You made choices, Cassandra. Deliberate, calculated choices. You didn't panic, you planned. You didn't make mistakes, you committed crimes. Against strangers, against your own family, against me. And even now, sitting here, you can't tell the truth. You can't say I'm sorry and mean it. You can only try to manipulate me into helping you escape the consequences." Cassandra's face went hard, the mask dropping completely. "What do you want me to say, Mother? That I'm a monster? That I deserve to rot in here? Would that make you happy?" "I want you to be honest," Eleanor said, and she felt tears rising, but forced them down. "Just once. I want you to be honest with me and yourself. I want to understand why you hate me enough to do what you did. Was it always there, that coldness? Or did something happen that I missed? Some wound I didn't see?" For a long moment, Cassandra was silent, and Eleanor thought maybe finally she would get something real. But then her daughter smiled, a small, bitter, terrible smile. "You really don't know, do you? You never saw me at all, Mother. You saw this perfect idea of a daughter, this miniature version of yourself who would smile and perform and be grateful for your upper-class life of quiet desperation. But I was never her. I wanted more. I deserved more. And you were just in the way. The words landed like blows, each one sharp and deliberate. Eleanor absorbed them, let them settle into her bones. This was the truth, raw and ugly. Her daughter didn't just not love her. Cassandra resented her very existence, had perhaps always felt that way, and all the years of pretending had been just that. Performance. There was nothing to save here, no relationship to rebuild. This is freedom, Eleanor thought, strange as it sounded. Knowing there's nothing left to fight for is its own kind of peace. She stood up, gathering her coat and purse, and looked down at her daughter one last time. "Goodbye, Cassandra," she said, and she walked out of the visiting room, out of the facility, into the cold afternoon air that felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. She would never see her daughter again. Of this she was certain, and that certainty, painful as it was, felt like the first honest thing between them in years. Was cutting off all connection the only way to survive family betrayal, or would this choice haunt her in the quiet moments when the house was too empty and the past too loud? Spring came to Boston with unexpected warmth, coaxing crocuses from the cold earth and painting the public garden in impossible shades of green. Eleanor stood at the window of her Commonwealth Avenue apartment, watching young mothers push strollers along the tree-lined streets, students from nearby universities sprawled on the grass, tourists snapping photos of the swan boats. Life continuing, oblivious to the small dramas of pain and recovery happening behind closed doors all over the city. She'd spent the winter months in a kind of hibernation, sorting through legal documents, finalizing the estate restoration, seeing a therapist twice a week to process the trauma of the past year. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Kim, had helped Eleanor understand that grief for a living person could be even more complicated than grief for the dead. "You're mourning who you thought your daughter was," Dr. Kim had explained. "That's a valid loss, maybe the most painful kind." But Eleanor had also been working on something else, something that had been growing in her mind since that day in the courthouse when victims thanked her for her courage. Thomas's estate, now fully restored to her control, totaled $38 million, even more than the original 33, thanks to investments that had matured in the months since his death. It was more money than she could ever spend, more than she needed or even wanted, and she kept thinking about all the other Eleanors out there. Elderly people being exploited by family members, isolated victims too afraid or ashamed to fight back, people who lacked the resources or knowledge to defend themselves against financial predators wearing the masks of loved ones. The idea had started small, just a vague notion that she should do something meaningful with the fortune she'd nearly lost. But as she researched, spoke with attorneys and advocates, learned the staggering statistics about elder abuse, the idea crystallized into something concrete and powerful. She would create a foundation, properly structured, well-funded, staffed by experts, dedicated to protecting elderly people from financial exploitation. It would offer free legal services, educational programs, emergency housing for those displaced by family members, and advocacy for stronger laws. She would call it the Thomas Ashford Foundation, honoring the man who'd tried to protect her even from beyond the grave. It would be her legacy and his, transformed from private tragedy into public good. James Chen helped her navigate the legal complexities of establishing a charitable foundation. They worked with accountants, lawyers specializing in nonprofit law, and advisors from existing elder advocacy organizations. Eleanor committed $15 million to the initial endowment, nearly half the estate, with plans to add more as the foundation grew. "This is extraordinary," James told her during one of their planning meetings, genuine admiration in his voice. "You're turning your pain into something that will help thousands of people. Thomas would be so proud." The words made Eleanor's eyes sting with unexpected tears. She hoped it was true. She hoped that somehow, wherever he was, Thomas knew she was finishing the work he'd started, protecting the vulnerable from those who would harm them. The foundation officially launched in May, with a small ceremony at a community center in Dorchester. Eleanor had resisted anything splashy or self-congratulatory. This wasn't about her redemption story or public image. It was about the work. She hired a director, a former prosecutor named Marcus Williams, who'd spent 20 years fighting elder abuse cases, and a small staff of social workers, lawyers, and advocates. They set up a hotline, created partnerships with local police departments and adult protective services, and began training programs for bank employees and healthcare workers, the people most likely to spot signs of exploitation. Within the first month, they'd fielded over 200 calls and opened 40 active cases. The need was staggering, overwhelming, and Eleanor felt both grateful she could help and horrified by how common this cruelty was. One case in particular stayed with her. An 82-year-old man named George Chen, no relation to James, had been systematically robbed by his grandson, who'd convinced George to sign over power of attorney and then drained his accounts, leaving him penniless and facing eviction. The foundation's lawyers took the case, got George emergency housing, and pursued criminal charges against the grandson. When Eleanor met George at the foundation's office, his gratitude was almost painful to witness. "You saved my life," he told her, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "I didn't think anyone would believe me. Didn't think anyone would care about an old man's problems. But you cared." Eleanor had to excuse herself afterward, overwhelmed by the weight of his words, by the realization that she had the power to change outcomes, to stand between vulnerable people and those who would harm them. But the work was also exhausting and emotionally draining in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every case was a variation on her own story: betrayal, greed, family members justifying theft with twisted logic or cold indifference. She saw herself in every victim, saw Cassandra in every perpetrator, and sometimes the parallels were almost too much to bear. Dr. Kim helped her establish boundaries, reminded her that she couldn't save everyone, that her role was to build a sustainable organization, not to personally absorb every tragedy. "You're doing something remarkable," her therapist told her, "but you have to protect yourself too, or you'll burn out and the foundation will suffer." It was good advice, though hard to follow when each new call brought a new story of exploitation and pain. By autumn, the Thomas Ashford Foundation had helped over 300 families, recovered millions of dollars in stolen assets, and secured criminal convictions in 17 cases. Local media covered their work, and other cities began reaching out, asking how to replicate the model. Eleanor found herself thrust into an unfamiliar role. Advocate, public speaker, the face of a movement to protect the elderly from financial predators. She gave interviews, testified before state legislative committees considering stronger elder protection laws, and spoke at conferences where policymakers and practitioners gathered to share strategies. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She, who'd spent most of her life in the background, supporting Thomas's career and Cassandra's ambitions, suddenly had her own purpose, her own voice, her own power. "I'm 62 years old," she thought sometimes with wonder, "and I'm just now becoming myself." The foundation wasn't just helping others, it was healing her, giving her betrayal meaning, transforming victimhood into agency. But late at night, alone in her apartment, she still sometimes wondered, was all this work a genuine calling, or just an elaborate way to avoid the emptiness where her family used to be? December arrived with snow that blanketed Boston in white silence, muffling the city's usual chaos. Eleanor stood in the restored Beacon Hill brownstone for the first time in over a year, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The legal battles had finally concluded, the property returned to her control, and she'd spent the past week deciding what to do with it. The house felt like a museum of her former life. Thomas's study still contained his desk and books. Her bedroom still held furniture they'd chosen together 30 years ago. Cassandra's childhood room remained frozen in time with swimming trophies and framed photos of a girl who'd never really existed. Eleanor had thought coming here would bring closure, but instead it brought only a kind of hollow recognition. This place was beautiful, historic, valuable, and completely meaningless to her now. She'd made a decision. The brownstone would become the permanent headquarters for the Thomas Ashford Foundation. She would donate the property, convert it into offices and meeting spaces, create a visible, accessible presence in the neighborhood where old Boston money had always turned a blind eye to uncomfortable realities. It felt right, using the house that had been both her haven and her prison to help others escape similar situations. Marcus Williams had been thrilled with the plan, already sketching out how they could use the space. Offices on the second floor, conference rooms on the third. The ground floor converted into a community resource center where elderly people could get advice on everything from estate planning to recognizing signs of exploitation. "This will be incredible," he'd said, his enthusiasm infectious. A real beacon, no pun intended, for the work we're doing. But as Eleanor walked through the empty rooms one last time, she felt Cassandra's absence like a physical presence. Her daughter had lived in this house, run down these hallways as a child, celebrated birthdays and holidays here, absorbed its privilege and its expectations into her bones. What had gone wrong? Eleanor had wrestled with that question for months now, trying to locate the moment when Cassandra's path had diverged from decency into cruelty. Doctor, Kim had gently suggested that perhaps there was no single moment, no clear answer. Some people lack empathy in ways that aren't visible until circumstances test them, she'd said. It's not necessarily about parenting failures or childhood trauma. Sometimes the capacity for connection just isn't there, and no amount of love can create it. The idea was both liberating and devastating. Eleanor hadn't failed as a mother. She'd simply loved someone incapable of loving her back. As she stood in Thomas's study, Eleanor's phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Mrs. Ashford? An unfamiliar voice, female, young, uncertain. "My name is Rebecca Brennan. I'm Derek Brennan's niece. I know this is probably the last call you want to receive, and I completely understand if you hang up. But I needed to reach out to you. I wanted to apologize." Eleanor's heart contracted. She'd never considered Derek's extended family, never thought about the collateral damage of the scandal beyond the immediate victims. "You don't need to apologize for your uncle's actions," Eleanor said carefully. "I don't hold his family responsible." "It's not just that," Rebecca continued, her words tumbling out quickly, as if she feared losing her nerve. "I wanted you to know, I'm starting law school next year. Public interest law. I want to work on cases like yours, help people who've been victimized by family members. What happened to you, what my uncle did, it changed my whole perspective on what matters, what I want to do with my life. I know this probably sounds strange, but I wanted to thank you for fighting back, for not just accepting what they did. You showed me what courage looks like." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes. She'd been so focused on the pain Cassandra and Derek had caused, she hadn't considered that maybe, somewhere, someone had been inspired by her refusal to be destroyed by it. "Rebecca," she managed, "that's wonderful. The world needs more people fighting for justice. If you're serious about this path, I'd like to help. The foundation offers internships for law students. If you're interested..." "Really?" The hope in Rebecca's voice was almost painful to hear. "That would be incredible. Thank you, Mrs. Ashford. Thank you so much." After the call ended, Eleanor stood in the gathering darkness of the study, watching snow fall past the windows. The cycle of harm and healing was more complex than she'd understood. Derek had damaged so many lives, but his actions had also catalyzed Rebecca's passion for justice, had inspired Eleanor's foundation, had exposed vulnerabilities in the legal system that could now be addressed. It didn't excuse the crimes, didn't balance the scales, but it suggested something important. That meaning could be excavated from tragedy, that purpose could grow in the crater left by betrayal. She thought about Thomas, about the secret courage he'd shown in his final year, gathering evidence while his heart struggled to keep beating. She thought about Cassandra, sitting in her prison cell, perhaps still unable to accept responsibility, perhaps still scheming for some future advantage. And she thought about herself, this new version of Eleanor Ashford who'd emerged from the wreckage, stronger, clearer, unafraid of her own power. As she locked the brownstone door for the last time as its owner, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. The grief was still there, probably always would be, but it no longer defined her. She'd been broken by betrayal and reforged by purpose, and in that transformation had discovered a truth Thomas had known all along. Sometimes the greatest act of love is protecting others from the harm we've survived ourselves. She walked down the Beacon Hill streets where she'd once belonged, headed toward Commonwealth Avenue where she'd built a new life, and felt winter's cold bite on her face like a clarification, a cleansing. The foundation would grow. More families would be helped. Rebecca and others like her would join the fight, and Cassandra would serve her sentence, a cautionary tale about greed that consumes everything it touches. This is not the ending I imagined for my life, Eleanor thought as snow gathered on her shoulders. But perhaps it's the one I was always meant to find. Yet one question lingered as she walked through the silent streets. Had she finally found peace, or had she simply learned to carry her wounds with more grace? And did the difference even matter? Justice, Eleanor Ashford discovered, is not the same as healing, though the two sometimes walk hand in hand for a while before diverging onto separate paths. She'd gotten everything the law could give her: her fortune restored, her daughter and son-in-law convicted, her story vindicated in the eyes of the world. The Thomas Ashford Foundation had helped hundreds of families avoid the fate she'd narrowly escaped, and its work continued to expand, drawing attention to the quiet epidemic of elder abuse that had been hiding in plain sight for generations. By any objective measure, she'd won. The villains had been punished, the victim had become a victor, and purpose had emerged from pain. It was the ending everyone wanted for her story. But late at night, in the quiet of her Commonwealth Avenue apartment, Eleanor sometimes allowed herself to acknowledge the truth beneath the triumph. She would never stop being a mother whose daughter had become a stranger, a wife who'd lost her husband before understanding the full weight of the secrets he'd carried, a woman who'd discovered that family could inflict wounds that time would diminish but never fully heal. The foundation gave her days meaning and her pain purpose, but it couldn't fill the specific emptiness where Cassandra used to live in her heart. She'd learned to live with that emptiness, to accept it as the permanent scar tissue from loving someone who'd been incapable of loving her back. Some losses, she'd come to understand, weren't meant to be recovered from, only survived, integrated, carried forward into whatever came next. What came next, for Eleanor, was a life more fully her own than any she'd lived before. At 63, she was building something that would outlast her, creating systems of protection that would shield others from the particular species of betrayal she'd endured. She'd discovered she had talents she'd never exercised, for leadership, for public speaking, for the kind of strategic thinking that built organizations designed to last. Thomas had seen those qualities in her, she realized now. He just never had the language to tell her they were there, dormant, waiting for crisis to wake them. In a strange way, Cassandra had given her that crisis, and thus inadvertently given her this second life, this unexpected flowering of competence and purpose. It was a gift Eleanor never would have chosen, but, having received it, refused to waste. The question she asked herself most often now was not about Cassandra or Thomas or even the foundation, but about the nature of transformation itself. Could a person truly change? Or did crisis simply reveal what had been there all along, waiting beneath the surface? She thought about Cassandra in prison, wondered if 12 years would crack open something in her daughter that had been closed and calcified, or if Cassandra would emerge from Danbury exactly as she'd entered, charming, manipulative, fundamentally disconnected from conscience. Eleanor had stopped hoping for redemption there, but she hadn't stopped hoping for understanding. Maybe someday Cassandra would send a letter that contained actual remorse instead of strategy. Maybe someday Eleanor would open it and find forgiveness possible. But she wasn't holding her breath, and she'd learned that healing didn't require that particular resolution. She could be whole without her daughter's apology, complete without her family's restoration. So Eleanor walked forward into her transformed life, carrying her scars like hard-won wisdom, teaching others what she'd learned about resilience and boundaries, and the fierce, unglamorous work of surviving betrayal without letting it poison you completely. The foundation thrived. New cases arrived daily. Laws changed slowly because of the advocacy work she and Marcus and their growing team pursued relentlessly. And sometimes, when spring returned to Boston and the swan boats glided through the public gardens lagoon, Eleanor would sit on a bench with coffee in hand and feel something close to contentment. Not the uncomplicated happiness she'd once taken for granted, but something deeper, harder earned, more honest. She'd been destroyed and rebuilt, and the second version of herself was leaner, stronger, less afraid of difficult truths. She'd learned that love without discernment could be dangerous, that family was defined by behavior rather than blood, and that the most powerful form of revenge was refusing to let cruelty make you cruel in return. To those reading this story, Eleanor's journey asks uncomfortable questions. What would you do if the person who betrayed you was someone you'd loved most in the world? Could you find the strength to fight back when fighting back meant destroying your own child, your own family, your own carefully constructed life? And harder still, if you survived that betrayal, if you emerged on the other side intact and even stronger, would you be grateful for the transformation, or would you forever mourn the innocence you'd lost? There are no easy answers to these questions, no neat moral that makes the pain worthwhile. But perhaps the lesson is simply this, that we are capable of far more than we imagine. More cruelty and more courage, more betrayal and more resilience, more destruction and more creation, and that the choice between those capacities defines us more truly than any inheritance, any family name, any fortune ever could. Eleanor Ashford made her choice. When your moment comes, and it will come, in some form, for everyone, what will yours be? Will you let betrayal make you smaller, or will you use it to discover exactly how vast you really are? Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If it touched you, or made you think about life in a different way, don't keep it just for yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear this too. And if you truly want to support this channel, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading what you have to say. And finally, if you really enjoyed it and want to help keep these stories alive, consider buying me a simple coffee on Ko-fi. Even the smallest gesture makes a big difference and helps us bring more stories like this to you. Thank you, and see you in the next one.